All right, it's 5:38. I'll bring them back, Viha.
Yeah.
All right. Oh, they're back.
Is the other team here? Not yet. Okay, before we start everything else, can the two teams at least just tell me who's going first and who's going second so that we can do that introduction?
I'm going PM.
Great.
Namita going first.
Namita's going LO, is it?
Yep.
Great.
Hi everyone, my name is Kimberly. I'm one of the co-conveners again. We're going to start the debate soon. I just want to tell everyone why we're having this demo debate and the purpose of it. So it is constitutionally required for us to have this debate. And the reason behind that is so that newer participants can listen and learn from it. So the purpose of it is to inherently have training and just exposure for new participants. Yeah, so this is constitutionally required. So in every AWDC, this is going to happen, and it's very good practice. So the speakers that we have today, it's going to be an opening half debate. In OG, we have Grace and Mary, and in OO, we have Kanan and Namita. And we'd just like to thank you for taking your time to do this demo debate for us. And Viha will be your chair today. Yeah, that's about it. I'll let Viha take it over for now. Enjoy, everyone.
All right, hi everyone. I'm gonna start by just sharing screen to let you see what the motion is, so that you know what the teams have been prepping. So the motion that they will be debating says, there is a device that could eliminate all memories you have of a particular person. This includes all emotions like grief, sadness, longing, happiness, warmth, etc., as well as any other remnants of that person from your life. You can never be reminded of this person ever again. This house, as someone experiencing a breakup, would use it. All right, that's the motion. Without further ado, we call upon Prime Minister Grace.
Can I be heard?
Yep.
Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. How happy is the blameless Vestal's lot, the world forgetting by the world forgot, eternal sunshine of the spotless mind. To call my exes a spot on my mind would be generous. Exes do not help you. They do not make you a better person. They hold you down. They are an ex for a reason, and for that reason, we want to forget them. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, when some setup and characterization of when we would use this. Secondly, why, very salient and simple point, why breakups suck. And thirdly, why the things that we may get from a relationship, e.g. happy memories or lessons learned, are worth forgetting as well. Firstly, when would we use this device? Obviously, there is a spectrum of breakups, and we think individuals are good arbiters for what is a breakup that is worth forgetting. That is to say, if you split amicably from an ex, you probably wouldn't choose to use this device because you don't have much of a need to use it. Let's say that you don't split amicably, but you don't feel that hurt by this person. You're just a little bit sad. You still wouldn't choose to use this device. It would be too much of a hassle. Clearly, individuals are using this device when the emotional pain from this breakup or the relationship was so toxic to such a degree that they feel the need to use this device. We think in those instances, this relationship is absolutely worth forgetting. In the best case scenario, you've learned nothing from these relationships. Maybe it was just a silly teenage fling that didn't make you grow as a person and just kind of makes you feel embarrassed. We think it's worth forgetting that person. But in the worst case scenario, there are actively toxic people that you absolutely should forget. So, given that, why breakups suck? Two things under this, why breakups suck in the short term and why they suck in the long term. Firstly, in the short term, three things under this. The first reason why breakups suck is just they are immensely emotionally painful. And that is bad in and of itself because we think the absence of pleasure and the presence of pain is a bad thing in and of itself. And people want to avoid that thing. But secondly, we think that it makes you act in irrational and terrible ways. Individuals do not deal well with extreme emotional pain, such as that comes out of a breakup. This means that individuals are likely to act in irrational and bad ways. They're likely to do reckless things. They are likely to turn to drugs and alcohol. Not speaking from personal experience or anything, I don't know, this is just a hypothetical. But we think that these individuals are not in the emotional state of mind to act rationally, especially because the person that is causing them pain was the person that they would look to, the first person they would look to for support in the first place. That compounds all of that emotional pain. The second reason why breakups suck, and linked to this, is they impair your functionality and your ability to live your life. When you go through a breakup and you have an exam the next day, you do worse on that exam because you're too busy feeling sad and distressed in order to concentrate. Maybe you don't go to work. Maybe you ruin friendships and relationships with your family because you're too caught up mourning for this ex. For that reason, we think that this is pain inflicted on you and also people around you because you are genuinely an unpleasant person to be around. I'm so sorry for anyone who's ever had to comfort me over a breakup. Second thing why breakups are bad, they're bad in the long term. Two things under this. Firstly, is that they ruin future relationships, right? In the best case scenario, even if your ex wasn't abusive or toxic, it means that you're less likely to trust people going forward. You're less likely to open yourself up to future relationships because you're hesitant. You're afraid of being hurt again. Again, this is just a hypothetical, not talking about anyone in particular, but you're probably afraid of going through that pain again, which means that holds you back from future relationships. It ruins relationships that could be fruitful, but they never started because you're held back as a result of your baggage. But even if you do get into a relationship, we think that your past relationships haunt and destroy your future relationships. Let's say your ex was particularly mean about a certain part of your body or a certain part of your personality. You will be forever insecure about that part of you, and you will carry that baggage into future relationships. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy and a cycle of toxicity because now you are so afraid of this one feature that you do not open yourself up and you do not trust your partner, which ruins the relationship before it begins. That's in the best case scenario. In the worst cases where you have been subject to abuse and toxicity by your ex, that doesn't just ruin your future relationships in a romantic sense, but all relationships, because now that trauma sticks with you. You can't trust other people. You can't trust friends. You can't trust family. Maybe you've been told that you're a worthless individual. Maybe you've been outright abused. All that trauma is just a negative thing in your life. To overcome it would be immensely difficult and expensive. And even if you have access to things like therapy, that is a really, really difficult process. We don't think we want to glamorize or valorize trauma in any way. Before I move on, I'll take a POI. Or not, that's okay. All right, so that's why breakups are bad. Here's why we don't care that we lose things when we forget this, i.e. just some preemptive about why it's okay. Firstly, why forgetting happiness is okay. We don't want to remember these happy memories. First reason is that these happy memories turn sad as soon as you have that breakup. It's like in Inside Out, where that memory becomes tinted and forever tainted with the sadness of the breakup. But secondly, we think that we should forget those happy memories because people use that as a reason to go back to their shitty exes. They forget what was so shitty and made them break up in the first place and can only remember the good times, which pushes people who should absolutely not be in a relationship anymore back into that relationship. We think that's bad for both people. Here's why it's okay to forget the lessons learned from a breakup. The first thing to note is that lessons learned are contingent. So this is only a good if those lessons learned are good. You can learn terrible lessons from a breakup. For example, you might blame yourself for it. That's a bad lesson to learn. It is the onus of opening opposition to prove that those lessons will be learned in a good way. But secondly, and importantly, we think we don't need to learn any lessons because if in the future we have another shitty breakup, we'll just use this device again. We do not need to grow as a person. There is no intrinsic value to suffering to growing as a person. If we could, we would hook ourselves up to the pleasure machine and only ever experience good things for the rest of our life. This is a get out of jail free card, which means that we never have to engage with those shitty harms that come from suffering, that come from trauma, to the extent that there is value in trauma and there is value in breakups. Those things only exist if you can't just magically forget your next relationship anyway. We'd be happy to use this device now. We'd be happy to use this device in future. So proud to propose.
We thank Prime Minister for that speech. We call upon Leader of Opposition, Namita.
Can I be heard?
Yep.
Yep. All right, just setting up my timer. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm actually really glad that Grace brought up the pleasure machine at the end of her speech, right? Because the way that you look about it, people in their rational senses, people who have actually had time to think about the decision of whether or not they would opt into a fabricated sense of reality where they only experience pleasure or they only experience things that they want at all points in time, are likely to be hesitant of ever opting into the machine. They're either going to do one of two things. They'll, one, blatantly say no, or two, take time to think about it. But I think the very fact that people hesitate into simply blindly opting into such a situation of fabricated happiness, of fabricated net good and always good, is tantamount to the fact that they do want things that actually make them feel, right? The point at which you feel emotion is not through things such as forgetting absolute memories about what happened, but you need to realize, and the way that you actually feel as a human is when you go through a breakup with the full emotions in its place. Why is that so? I think the very fact that you actually feel something after a breakup, that you get super sad or that you get super frustrated, is tantamount to the value that you had in the relationship itself. Therefore, I think it's unfair for opening government to claim that there was absolutely nothing to learn from that. Because I think if I wasn't very happy in the relationship at all, or if I never was meaningfully invested in that person, then I'm unlikely to be super sad in the breakup, or it's unlikely to affect me to that degree. Which means, conversely as well, it's extremely likely that you had a meaningful relationship with that individual in the event that you choose to opt into this machine. 4 things within my speech. First, simply why it's wrong for you to take this sedative or like this thing at a specific instance, because we characterize this as an extreme situation of like prolonged and permanent sense of denial that people experience after a breakup, and why you shouldn't prioritize this easy opt-out. Secondly, on why this form of coping mechanism is bad. Thirdly, on the importance of memories. Fourthly, on self-reflection. Then just touching on a bit on growth and why a sense of closure is something that's extremely important. Before that, let's just deal with what opening government gets to. We broadly get 2 situations. I think firstly, in terms of why something is emotionally painful and why that's bad. I think the very fact that they identify this as people who are irrational, as people who are super duper sad in nature, is the very fact why it's wrong for you to opt into this. Because at this specific instance, I might be feeling a lot of pain, right? But I think the pain that you feel in the immediate sense of a breakup is probably the degree to which you blame the breakup on the other individual. Which is to say, if someone chooses to break up with me 5 minutes before this debate, I'm unlikely to think that I'm the bad person here, right? I'm always constantly going to blame the other person for breaking up with me. At least that's what you get on the short term value. Why we think that's necessarily bad is for a couple of reasons. I think one, the point at which you sort of forget the scenario, or the point at which you forget the scenario at all, is when you're unlikely to grow as an individual. Because I think the very aspect of relationships, or the very aspect of coping mechanism, comes with you ever like stepping out from the denial phase of your relationship and opting into the next phase, which is probably like acting out to a certain degree, right? I think what opening government then needed to show to you is why this literally, like, you forgetting memories in entirety is not something that stays within this denial phase but also moves towards self-destructive tendencies. I'm simply not sure why that's the only thing that factors into this debate. But secondly, on perception, right, I think the very fact that opening government tries to identify this as people find you annoying is absolutely false. I think people tend to sympathize more because of the way how society is literally romanticized, because of the way people's faces light up and how much they talk about relationships. People are likely to sympathize with the other individual when they feel sad after a breakup. They're likely to offer them things like food. They're likely to offer them things like themselves for comfort, or to talk about themselves just like a generic conversation because they sympathize with them. As opposed to if you literally show up, take this pill without any sort of emotion whatsoever, they're going to be a little bit either super cautious of you because now you seem like this cold-hearted, demon-hearted bitch who has no care for a relationship whatsoever. And given that people place so much emphasis on the way you view relationships, it's also sort of an indicating factor as to how you react to other people. Which is to say, if you don't feel sad at all, or if you literally don't want to remember anything about the person at all, people tend to view you negatively simply because they think the way it reflects on your relationship with them is also that you don't care, and therefore you've distanced yourself in all areas of life and not necessarily romantically. We think that's bad. Thirdly, on like memories and the importance of memories. Look, opening government tries to claim that everything that's happy tends to become sad, and therefore that in and of itself is something that's bad. I tend to disagree with this, right? Because even if all your happy memories are, let's say, factored in with the sadness of a breakup at this current point, I don't think that's likely to continue. But even if it is, we think that's completely all right. We think it's completely all right for you to remember the sort of adventures that you had, or remember the sort of actions that you took with that sort of pain, because at least you feel something, right? I think without the element of you ever being able to feel or being react to certain memories, I'm not particularly sure how that makes you human in and of itself. Probably similar to just saying a machine, probably similar to being in a relationship with a robot or something. Thirdly, on self-reflection and growth. Look, I already spoke about to a certain extent on why you're likely to blame the other individual and why that's bad, right? But I think the idea of self-reflection largely comes through one, you're likely to be really, really frustrated, and I think this frustration is good because you can channel it to a good cause. Sure, there is a possibility of people drinking their way through a breakup. That might be bad, but I think conversely, frustration actually helps you focus on the things that went wrong within your relationship. But I think the most important aspect of this, lastly, becomes that the absence of closure that you have. Because I do think you're still aware of the fact that X person existed, you were in a relationship with X person, but you have absolutely no idea of why you broke up, how you broke up, what factors led to that. I think that's extremely bad because even if you can go and hold a civil conversation to them, at best they're only likely to tell you the events that happened. You're not going to be able to figure out exactly what the tipping point of the situation was, exactly what made that like switch turn because of which you had to opt out to the relationship. We think that's extremely bad because the only way people get out of denial and the only way people are able to cope with themselves is when they get a sense of closure. To get a sense of closure, you need to have memories and strong emotions. Very, very proud to oppose.
Well, right, we thank Leader of Opposition. We now call upon Deputy Prime Minister Mary.
Can everyone hear me all right?
Yep.
Oh, alrighty. I think OO's arguments work really well in the abstract. They work well when you're looking through the 7 stages of grief, but they don't work so well when you examine a real human relationship and the way you feel as you go about it. 3 points in this speech as to why we love that pleasure machine and we'll hook ourselves up to it for all eternity. Firstly, why do you actually feel bad after a breakup? And what does that result in? Secondly, why this machine is actually good for you in the long run to the extent that we care about long-term growth. And lastly, if I get time for it, even if you don't get long-term growth, why short-term happiness actually trumps that. So firstly, why do you feel bad after a breakup? Notably here, a lot of OO's mechanisms and impacts rely on their one characterization that after a breakup, you tend to blame the other person and then magically introspect. If that is the case, then I would love to have Namita's confidence going into any relationship or breakup ever. I don't think that's really the case. You don't feel bad in a breakup because you blame the other person and you hate them. You feel bad because you hate yourself. 2 reasons why. Firstly, when you're in a relationship that requires you to be emotionally vulnerable, even if it's a shitty relationship, the amount of time and effort you spend on that emotional vulnerability, trying to understand another person's needs and match that into your own life, means that you inextricably get that sense of identity attached to that relationship. You try to work out this is who you are as a person in that relationship. As a result, when a relationship goes wrong, your thought isn't, wow, they suck, what an absolute, I'm not going to swear because we're on live. Instead, what you think is, what did I do wrong? Why was I not lovable enough? Why was I not good enough? You replay every fight over and over in your head. And this issue is actually compounded for people who may be structurally oppressed, such as women who have to take on more emotional labor, such as people of color who are always told by all of society that something's wrong with them. So it's probably not their partner's fault, it's actually you. But also, if you're just a generally good human being, you probably blame yourself anyway. But secondly, you tend to mourn the waste of time and energy that went into it. As a result, because it is so internalized into you that it was your fault that this relationship broke up, and even if you hate that other person, you do turn to those self-destructive tendencies because you are mourning what you could have had and you try to dull that pain. Those self-destructive tendencies could be anything, whether it be sleeping around in a way that isn't healthy for you, whether it is going to be drinking, whether it's going to be drugs, but it is all about numbing that pain. And we think in the comparative of this debate, what's probably better for you in the long run is if you just go to a machine to forget your ex, as opposed to drink a lot and get liver problems for the rest of your life. So even just on that basic comparative, we win this debate. But secondly, you also do have those external factors. Your friends don't sympathize with you when you're crying over your wine 2 weeks after your relationship. They go, oh my God, please stop talking about this. And even if they love you and support you, they secretly hate you. And you start to think they secretly hate you too. But importantly, your friends and family go, oh, what happened to blah, blah? What a lovely young lady or what man that was. And you go, oh, we broke up, and you have to have that conversation again and again. Much better to forget and go, I don't know what you're talking about, and they feel crazy instead. So secondly, firstly, to conclude that point, you feel bad after a breakup. That feeling is serious, it is harmful, and we'd rather not have it, but also it does lead to self-destructive tendencies that are worse for you in that short and long term. So secondly, that leads on to why the machine is good for you in the long run. Firstly, some relationships just make you worse. They make you unhappy and they make you less unhappy in future. So even a decent relationship, let's talk you through a normal, basic relationship breakup. You meet a cute girl, you fall in love, you go on lots of dates. You don't communicate your feelings well enough and your needs, so you start not spending enough time together, and you start to feel distant when you do feel together. You feel like they don't understand you. You start to feel unlovable, all alone, even when you're cuddled up together. Finally, you do express a need. They feel a bit weird about it. You feel weird that they feel weird about it. You have a fight. You can't be bothered making up. In that relationship and that normal situation breakup, what lessons have you learned? You haven't actually learned how to communicate better, because what triggered your fight is when you finally expressed a need, you felt unloved, ununderstood, and unsympathized with. So instead, the lessons you get are mistrust, not to communicate your needs, and to make yourself a better person because clearly you're unworthy of a relationship. even if they say, oh, but you're going to focus on what went wrong, because of the immediate pain of the breakup and the internalizing, actually, like they said, you are biased. You learn the wrong things. To the extent that you do learn the right things, so even if you go back and go, look, I should have learned to communicate better. Oh, wait, I've clicked the button. I've lost that lesson. You go into your next relationship. You no longer have that baggage of not having that trust in another partner. You don't have that baggage of, I'm never communicating my needs again. You come in fresh and new. You still might not be communicating your needs very well, but let's say the difference between a toxic relationship where that causes a fight and breakup versus a good relationship where your partner or your partners come to you and say, I feel like you're not being honest with me all the time. Do you feel comfortable talking to me about your needs? That is a healthy relationship where you learn the lesson in a positive way. Even if you do eventually break up because maybe your needs are incompatible, we don't think that's the sort of relationship you're going to choose to forget, because those happy memories would outweigh the bad and you would have that sense of growth. Alternatively, you would stay with them forever and love them forever in this beautiful, healthy communication, like absolute hub of happiness. Either way, you can learn that growth and you can learn to be happy in a productive way. You can learn that lesson slightly later on in life, because if it is bad and you've learned it the wrong way and you feel sad about it, you can just delete that. Tough luck. So we think in the long run, firstly, you do actually learn better lessons, but secondly, you learn them in a healthy way that is more likely to make you feel happy and without that incredible short-term pain that a breakup is always going to cause. So lastly, why do we actually value that short-term happiness trumping long-term growth? Note that we only need to go to this if firstly, you don't believe you're a good self-manager, or secondly, none of those benefits of long-term happiness actually accrue because you now no longer carry baggage from your last relationship in and you are actually able to communicate like a normal human person. Long-term growth is actually pretty amorphous. And we think that given the choice, most people don't really care if they're more empathetic or they're better communicators to the extent that it doesn't cause them more happiness. We think that most people tend to be altruistic and want to grow as a person because it actively gives them rewards. If they're religious, maybe they go to heaven. If they're just like an altruistic person, maybe they like the status, maybe they like the feeling of being able to help others. Overall, that short-term pain is worth more than the amorphous being a better person. Because if every time you have a shitty relationship and that cycle continues, you just delete it, move on to your next one and hope it's better next time. So happy to propose and forget all of my exes.
All right, we thank Deputy Prime Minister for that speech, and to close this demo debate out, we call upon Deputy Leader of Opposition, Kanan.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. So 3 things in this speech. Firstly, regarding short-term harms. Secondly, about the long-term harms. And lastly, if I have enough time, how this is particularly damaging for people who were stuck within domestic abusive or like toxic relationships. So, and all rebuttals will be integrated. And I'll try not to be too serious because I tend to do that in my speeches. So firstly, let's talk about short-term harms, right? So I think the government side's main argument was that this leads to people having worse coping mechanisms, because often when people suffer their relationships, they do things like run to alcohol, they do things like run to drugs, they do things like run and sleep around, right? Firstly, I don't think we ever actually heard why it was bad to do drugs, why it was bad to sleep around, or why it was bad to consume excessive amounts of alcohol. But secondly, we think that majority of people do not run to that kind of extreme coping method, right? As in the majority of people are taught from a young age that it's not very good to sleep around, or that it's not very good to have a massive consumption of drugs. I think that's also something that's internalized within us. And a lot of us have a subconscious and reactive kind of rejection of that kind of action. So I think that the majority of people actually don't run to drugs, or they don't run to such massively damaging actions, even in the case where they're emotional, even in the case where they're irrational, right? So we think that in the majority of cases, they don't actually do things as extreme as drugs or as extreme as alcohol. So we think that the more realistic harm is probably things like sleeping around, probably things like locking yourself up in your room all day and crying, things like excessively consuming ice cream and crying on the floor, right? So why is this not such a big harm? We think that this is extremely short term for 3 reasons, right? Firstly, we think that there's community support, as in we do concede, as in government side says, that people around you will probably feel exhausted that you're talking about this relationship over and over again, but they're probably not going to say that to your face if they're your friend. So you can still get that comfort of talking to them. You can still feel better. You can still feel good about yourself because your friends will try to convince you that you're not such a bad person, that there are positive aspects to your personality. Secondly, obviously you have coping mechanisms, right? Like your relationship is not the only traumatic experience that you've had throughout your entire life. You've probably faced self-hate through failing a math test. You've probably faced rejection by not getting in the corporation you want to get in, and job hunting, which I'm going through right now. So you probably have learned through other experiences how to deal with things like self-hate, how to deal with things that are hard in this way, right? But thirdly, we think that there, in the worst case scenario, there are things like therapy, there are things like antidepressants that your family would probably try to get you to do in the case where you're running to really radical actions and really fucking up your life. Oh, sorry, I cussed. Really screwing up your life, right? So we think that at best, it's a short-term harm that will be alleviated in the long run. Alleviated in the long run. And also, I forgot to add this, because of the effects of memory, like eventually you do forget this person, you do forget the worst aspects of this relationship in the extremely long run, right? So we think it's best, we think it's at best, it's something that can be kind of, that's very short term, that's something that will be alleviated in the long run, right? So what was the short term harm that Namita brought you, right? She told you that it was likely to be that you were going to be rejected by the people around you. You were going to be seen as a cold bitch or as a player, right? Because notice that even if you forget this person, this other person doesn't forget about you, right? If this person that you dated was your coworker, other coworkers see that other person crying, other person being depressed because they left that relationship, but they see you being perfectly calm, talking to that person as if nothing ever happened, and being perfectly happy, right? We thought that kind of bullying or exclusion at work, being harassed as being cheap or as a player or as a cold bitch, was probably much worse, because places like school, places like work, these are not places that you can leave easily. You're probably going to stay within these places for years, as opposed to like the harm of a breakup, which is likely to last for like what, 3, 4, 5 months, I wouldn't know. But I think that in that sense, the harm that we brought you was far worse in the short term, right? So secondly, in terms of long term, and we think that this is far more important than the short-term benefits that they talk about, and I'll mention that later, right? So I think that they had mainly 2 points about 3 points regarding long-term harm, right? Firstly, that you learn things like self-hate, and that makes you insecure and not willing to open up. Firstly, we think that, as I mentioned earlier, there are other sort of coping mechanisms. There are things like people who are willing to comfort you. So we don't think that's going to be like a severely awful harm that happens. But secondly, we say that this is good, right? Because if you hate yourself, you start to think, what did I do wrong? What is wrong with me? And we think that you start to, because you have an incentive to not screw up future relationships, or you have an incentive to not to hate yourself, you have an incentive to improve, right? And they talked about things like internalization. We think that internalization is good because it makes you careful, right? Because at the point where you internalize that, for example, you tend to be a bad person, you tend to, for example, be desperate and needy and always like rely on your partner, we think that means that when you get into the next relationship, because you've internalized it, you're likely to remember those lessons and carry them throughout that relationship, right? We think that's overall quite positive. But secondly, they talked about things like trust and communication, right? Firstly, like considering that the person that you're dating is a completely different from the relationship that you had before, I don't understand why you wouldn't trust this person. But secondly, I think that like having trust issues isn't necessarily a bad thing. The fact that you're extremely careful about whether you want to date this person, whether you want to be emotionally invested in this person, I think is a good thing, because if you randomly just start dating people and getting emotionally invested in them, obviously the harm that happens when you have to break up with them is huge. So I think that's still on net good. I'll take a POI.
Okay, in a toxic or a bad relationship, the lesson you end up learning is you suffer when you express your emotions. Surely it is better to just delete that lesson, delete that person, and keep going until you find someone who doesn't make you suffer for expressing yourself.
Like, firstly, I don't understand why that's necessarily true. I think sometimes people suffer because they don't communicate their emotions. But secondly, I think that it's sometimes the problems that you have when you suffer through relationships, things like being overly needy, things like being a slob. These are traits that will haunt bruise your relationships as well, and probably fuck them up as well. So I don't think it's just that you magically meet a perfect, handsome, wonderful person one day and all will go well, right? So why is long-term benefit and learning to grow more important than the short-term harm that they talk about, right? We think that simply when you're in your mid-50s and you're too old to have kids, and you have you're in a market where there's probably less demand for you to get married because you're a bit older, we think that that's a much more hollow feeling, and that's a much bigger harm to you, right? As in at Gov's best case, what they mitigate is an extremely short-term harm, short-term crying on the floor and eating ice cream, right? We asked them on our side of the house, what people suffer through is things like being in their mid-50s and realizing that they wanted to build a family, they wanted to have kids, they wanted to have this wonderful family life, and they couldn't necessarily achieve that because they were constantly not learning from their mistakes, because they couldn't improve enough to go through extremely long-term relationships, such as marriage, such as having children and going through those hardships, right? We think that is a far more permanent and long-term and terrible harm compared to what happens in government paradigm, and for those reasons, we are happy to oppose.
Okay, thank you. We thank all speakers for joining us and doing this demo debate for us. That's the end of the demo debate. We hope you learned a lot from that. We'll hand it back to the upcoming